Hello, my name is Maj.General Gorden. I'm the Chief of Staff and Head of Mission of the United Nations Truth Supervision Organisation. I'm honoured to be a part of these celebrations which mark the 60th anniversary of the death of Count Folke Bernadotte, the United Nations mediator. To give some background to these celebrations, I'd like to outline the events that took place on or about the 17th of September 1948. I'll begin with a book written by Count Folke Bernadotte about his experiences during World War II, in particular with the Red Cross. The book is called Instead of Arms. I'll read from the postscript to the book from Folke Bernadotte. He writes, "I had just finished the last chapters of this book when one day in the end of May I received a telegram from the Secretary-General of the United Nations, Trivigeli, inquiring if I would be willing to undertake the mission as United Nations mediator in the Palestine conflict. My first reaction was a feeling of deep gratitude for having been considered for such a complicated and responsible task. But at the same time, I naturally felt great hesitation as to whether I ought to accept. I knew, of course, that the chances for success were very slim. On the other hand, I am of the opinion that one should not only undertake tasks whose chances for success are evident, and that one should not be guided by consideration for personal prestige when it is a question of carrying out a difficult task." This was a book that Count Folke Bernadotte finished in 1948. Just before he began his work as the United Nations mediator. The nomination of the Count as the United Nations mediator was accepted by the Security Council, and with their support he began his work. I'll now pick up the story shortly afterwards when the Count and the mediator was in Amman. I read again from a book by Count Bernadotte called To Jerusalem. This was a book he was dictating during his time as the mediator. Much of the dictation took place on his aeroplane or as he travelled around the region, dictated to his secretary, Barbara Vessel. He writes, "The 3rd of June, a most interesting day. It began with my being wakened in the morning with the news that a telegram had arrived from Trivigeli. The contents were as follows. I'm requested by the President of the Security Council to inform you that the Security Council, at its 311th meeting held on the 2nd of June 1948, having taken cognizance of the acceptance of the Security Council resolution of the 29th of May by all parties, decided to authorise the United Nations mediator in accordance with his suggestion contained in his telegram of the 2nd of June to fix the effective date for the ceasefire in consultation with the two parties and the Truce Commission." Now we'll jump forward to September 1948. In that month, much of the time was spent by Folke Bernadotte in the region and in his residence on the Greek island of Rhodes, preparing his peace proposal. On the 16th of September, Folke Bernadotte prepared to leave Rhodes again for the Middle East. He had with him a completed report to the UN Security Council. I'll read to you a component of the report that he finished before he left Rhodes on the 16th of September. "I have employed abundantly both reason and persuasion, but to date neither agreement between the parties nor a basis for an agreement has been found. I do not conclude, however, that the problem of Palestine is insoluble by peaceful means or that a basis for agreement cannot ultimately be found. But the conclusion is inescapable that at some juncture vital decisions will have to be taken by the General Assembly if a peace settlement is to be achieved. I am firmly convinced, after the most careful appraisal, that this juncture has now been reached. I do not believe that merely prolonging the truce will automatically enhance the prospects for an ultimate peaceful settlement, but I do believe that prompt action by the General Assembly at its third session will greatly strengthen such prospects. Folke Bernadotte left Rhodes at 5 a.m. on the morning of the 16th of September and flew with his personal staff to Beirut. There they had consultations, and at 2 p.m. that afternoon they flew on to Damascus. Next morning, early, they departed Damascus and flew down towards Jerusalem, landing at the airfield at Calandia, which is in the north of Jerusalem. The plan was for them to go to Ramallah to visit the Arab League and then on to Jerusalem itself. After visiting the Arab League in Ramallah, they then headed towards Jerusalem and went to the YMCA Hotel in King David Street for lunch. In the afternoon, they had planned to visit Government House. Government House had for some time been considered as a possible residence and a headquarters for Folke Bernadotte. But there were concerns expressed about him using Government House. Firstly, the Israeli authorities had concerns about being able to secure the residence, which had formerly been the residence of the British governor of the mandated territory of Palestine. Secondly, Folke Bernadotte's UN advisors were concerned about the possibility of keeping Government House resupplied, having to cross two front lines. And finally, Folke Bernadotte himself had reservations about moving in to the former residence of the British governor just 4 months after the departure of the British, because of the hostility that was felt towards the British. But they visited the headquarters, and Folke Bernadotte was shown around by Dr. Pierre Fassel, who was a Swiss doctor who had turned Government House into a hospital. The Chief of Staff for Folke Bernadotte was General Åge Lundström from Sweden. He wrote a short account of the visit of Folke Bernadotte and his party to Government House. We then proceeded through the neutral zone to Government House, where Dr. Fassel showed us over the magnificent grounds and the palace with its banqueting halls, reception rooms, and any number of finely furnished bedrooms. It would indeed have been a headquarters for the Mediator. After the visit, the party left to return to the YMCA, but stopped off briefly at a place known as the Israeli Agricultural School, not far from Government House. Then they continued their journey. The convoy had 3 cars. In the first car was the Israeli Army liaison officer, a Captain Moshe Hillman. The car was driven by a Major Massart, a Belgian officer who was the military observer in charge of the Arab sector in Jerusalem, and Barbara Vessel, who was Folke Bernadotte's secretary. In the second car was Dr. Pierre Fassel, the doctor in charge of the hospital, who was joining the Count on his way to Government House. And finally, in the third car was the Count himself. His driver was Mr. Frank Begley, formerly of the FBI, who was a security officer with the United Nations. In the front of the car with Frank Begley was Lieutenant Colonel William Fox of the United States Marines. He was the military observer in charge of the Jewish sector in Jerusalem. In the back seat on the right side was Folke Bernadotte. Next to him, in the middle, was Colonel André Sarraut, a French officer and the senior military observer in Jerusalem. And finally, also in the back seat, was General Åge Lundström, the Chief of Staff of the military observers. They took a somewhat circuitous route back to the YMCA, chosen by the security officer Frank Begley, in order to avoid, as far as they could, snipers that might be on the route. They drove through the Greek colony and to the German colony, and finally entered Palamak Street, not far from the YMCA. They came across an Israeli checkpoint. The liaison officer Colonel Hillman shouted out to the Israeli soldiers, "It's okay, it's the UN mediator," and the Israeli soldier raised the barrier. Further on up Palmach Street, they approached a small store. A car drove out from behind the store and blocked the road. It was an Israeli army jeep with 4 people inside, dressed in uniform. When the car stopped, 3 of the soldiers got out and ran towards the convoy, 2 down the left-hand side. As they got to the first car, Captain Hillman shouted again, "It's okay, it's the UN mediator." These 2 men in uniform then started shooting at the car, the tyres and the radiator. The third person who'd got out of the car, which blocked their road, ran down the other side of the convoy, the right-hand side, and stopped at Count Folke Bernadotte's car. He put his automatic weapon through the open back window and started firing. 6 bullets into Folke Bernadotte and 18 into Colonel Sereau. There was great confusion, but finally the convoy managed to get away and they sped to the Hadassah hospital, only about 5 or 8 minutes away. Unfortunately, when they arrived at the hospital, Folke Bernadotte and Colonel Sereau were both declared dead. After they had cleaned up the bodies, they took them back to the YMCA, where they lay in state. A simple service was held, and a guard of observers was mounted inside the room for the night. The new Israeli government, the deputy mediator, and world leaders expressed outrage at the killings. It is a fact that no one has ever been held accountable for the death of Folke Bernadotte and Colonel Sereau. The work as the United Nations mediator was continued by the deputy, Dr. Ralph Bunche, and in 1949 he succeeded in concluding armistice agreements between Israel and Lebanon, Israel and Syria, Israel and Jordan, and Israel and Egypt. And the work of the peacekeepers, the United Nations Truth Supervision Organisation, continues 60 years later. In those 60 years, 32 peacekeepers have died, including Folke Bernadotte and Colonel Sereau. The last 4 died during the war between Israel and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon in July 2006. Members of the United Nations Truth Supervision Organisation, with the support of the UN Security Council and the Member States, are proud to continue their work to search for a comprehensive and long-lasting peace in the region. We in UNTSO look forward to continuing our contacts with the Folke Bernadotte Academy.